The Imperium keeps weapons you've never heard of. Not for Xenos, not for heretics, for its own people. Entire worlds wiped clean when they asked the wrong questions or made the wrong requests. Billions dead, no invasion, no trial, just silence. These weren't accidents, they were policy. So what happens when the man cataloging these weapons discovers his own planet on the list? The chamber existed 3 kilometers beneath the inquisitorial fortress on Carsavan Prime, carved into bedrock that predated the Gothic Wars, accessible only through a series of unmarked transit corridors that smelled of machine oil and something older, something that might have been fear-soaked into stone over centuries. I was assigned to the archive on a morning that began like any other, summoned by a grey-robed administrator whose augmetic eyes never quite focused on my face, handed a data slate with security clearances I had not requested, and a mandate I had not sought. The words were simple, bureaucratic, stripped of ceremony. Catalog and cross-reference deprecated compliance instruments. Subsector Throneward, operational years 823 to 967 M41. Standard archival duty. The kind of work that kept servants like me occupied during the long intervals between active investigations, when the Inquisition needed its scholars sequestered and productive, but not dangerously curious. I descended alone. The lift cage rattled through shafts lined with ceramite plating, past checkpoints manned by servitors whose vocalizers had been removed, past blast doors thick enough to survive orbital bombardment. The air grew colder with each level. By the time I reached the vault entrance, my breath formed pale clouds that dissipated slowly, as if reluctant to contaminate the silence. 2 servo skulls flanked the archway, their eye sockets glowing a dull amber, recording my biometrics with clicks that echoed like insect legs on glass. The door unsealed with a pneumatic hiss, and the smell that emerged was not decay or dust, but something clinical, antiseptic, the scent of preservation rather than abandonment. The vault stretched beyond my visible range. Stacks rose in geometric precision, row after row of steel shelving units laden with sealed containers, data cores wrapped in lead foil, physical documents preserved in stasis fields that shimmered faintly in the dim lumens overhead. Each section was labeled with alphanumeric codes that corresponded to nothing in my reference materials, organized according to a schema that prioritized obfuscation over accessibility. I understood immediately that this was not merely an archive. It was a tomb for knowledge deemed too dangerous to destroy, but too corrosive to openly acknowledge. The Imperium keeps many secrets, but some secrets are buried so deeply that even their existence becomes classified, nested within clearances that recursively erase themselves from institutional memory. I began with Subsector Throneward, compliance year 823. The first container held nothing extraordinary. Bolter modifications, autocannon variants designed for high-gravity deployment, Prometheum dispersal systems optimized for trench warfare. Standard tools of conquest, unremarkable except for their age and the meticulous detail with which their specifications had been preserved. I logged each item with the thoroughness drilled into me during decades of scholastic conditioning, noting serial numbers, deployment theaters, estimated casualty efficiencies. The work was tedious, hypnotic, the kind of repetition that allows the mind to drift while the hands continue their labor. Hours passed without event. I consumed a ration bar without tasting it, hydrated from a flask whose contents had gone lukewarm. The pattern broke with container Theta 7-9. Inside, nestled in foam padding that had yellowed with age, lay a data core no larger than my fist. Its casing was black ceramite, unadorned except for a single sigil etched into its surface, a double-headed eagle with its wings folded inward, talons gripping a cracked sphere. Beneath the sigil, in high Gothic script, so small I needed a magnifier to read it, were 3 words: Internal Compliance Arsenal. I inserted the core into my analyzer, bypassed the standard authentication protocols with credentials that opened more doors than I had realized I possessed, and watched as the data unspooled across my display in cascading columns of text and imagery that made my hands go cold. Nerve Agent Theta Prime. Deployment History. Hive World Velmora, Subsector Thronewood, 827 M41. The world had exceeded its tithe obligations for 3 consecutive generations, achieved industrial output metrics that ranked it among the sector's most productive assets, maintained a population of 42 billion spread across 17 hive clusters, whose spires reached into the upper atmosphere. Official records indicated exemplary loyalty, minimal heretical incidents, 0 recorded uprisings. And yet, according to the documentation now scrolling before me, compliance officers had identified what they termed a structural inconvenience. The population had begun organizing labor councils. Productivity improvements had come not from increased imperial oversight, but from worker-initiated efficiency reforms. Tithes were paid in full, but accompanied by petitions requesting infrastructure investment, medical supplies, educational expansion. The requests were not demands. They were not refusals. They were simply requests, filed through proper channels, composed with appropriate deference, backed by carefully prepared arguments demonstrating how such investments would further increase output and tithe reliability. The Imperium responded with Nerve Agent Theta Prime. The files contained engineering specifications rendered in the precise technical language of Mechanicus documentation. A weaponized compound, molecularly designed to bind with neural tissue within seconds of atmospheric exposure, inducing catastrophic system failure across the entire central nervous system. Death occurred in 4 to 6 seconds, accompanied by total muscle paralysis that prevented victims from crying out or warning others. No pain receptors fired. Consciousness simply ceased, instantly and irrevocably, leaving bodies that appeared merely asleep. The agent dispersed as an invisible gas, heavier than standard atmosphere, flowing downward through ventilation systems and hab block corridors, settling into the lower levels where worker populations concentrated. 17 billion dead in 8 hours. The dispersal systems had been installed covertly over a 3-month period, disguised as atmospheric recyclers, integrated into infrastructure the population trusted and maintained themselves. When the order came, when some distant authority decided that labor councils represented an unacceptable precedent regardless of their actual impact on productivity, the agent released simultaneously across all 17 hives. Morning shift workers collapsed at their stations. Children died in their sleep. The elderly, the infirm, the pregnant, the newborn. All simply stopped, preserved in whatever posture death had found them. Their faces peaceful because the agent did not permit the body time to register distress. The survivors were manageable. 25 billion remained in the upper hive levels, the administrative and mercantile classes whose loyalty was assumed due to their distance from labor, whose compliance could be secured through carefully managed narratives. The official explanation was a viral outbreak, tragic but natural, requiring immediate quarantine and memorial rites. New workers were imported from neighboring systems. Production resumed within 6 weeks. Tithe schedules were maintained. Velmora continued to function, its remaining population never knowing that the empire they served had methodically exterminated half their world, not for rebellion or heresy, but for requesting resources. I sat motionless, staring at the screen until the lumens dimmed into standby mode. My hands found the flask and drank without tasting, performing rituals of normalcy while my thoughts fragmented into configurations I could not yet assemble into comprehension. This was not an anomaly. The documentation was too detailed, too systematic, filed with the same bureaucratic precision applied to requisition forms and maintenance schedules. Someone had designed Nerve Agent Theta Prime with the same careful attention to efficiency that might be applied to developing a better lasgun power cell. Someone had calculated dispersal vectors, optimized molecular stability, conducted test deployments whose results were referenced but not detailed. Someone had written operational protocols, specifying weather conditions and ventilation patterns that maximized effectiveness. Noting that humid atmospheres prolonged agent viability, while high winds required increased concentration, someone had done this knowing exactly what it was. I returned to the container, searching for additional cores, and found 17 more. Each one contained specifications for a different weapon, each designed for deployment against Imperial populations, each optimized for specific scenarios and population densities. There were incendiary compounds that burned without flame, consuming oxygen at the cellular level so that victims suffocated in open air, their lungs collapsing inward while leaving no external burns to suggest foul play. There were acoustic devices that operated below human hearing range, generating standing waves tuned to disrupt cardiac rhythm, causing mass heart failure across targeted population zones while leaving infrastructure intact. There were bioengineered plagues calibrated to Imperial genetic markers, ensuring they would devastate human populations while leaving Xenos laborers and livestock unharmed, useful when compliance required eliminating human elements without disrupting economic output. Each weapon shared common design principles. They were invisible, leaving minimal forensic evidence. They were deniable, with effects that mimicked natural disasters or medical crises. They were selective, allowing authorities to eliminate specific population segments while preserving others. They were efficient, requiring minimal deployment resources and no prolonged military occupation. And they were quiet, killing in ways that prevented panic, resistance, or the spread of dangerous information to neighboring systems. The Imperium had industrialized the extermination of its own citizens, not as a last resort, employed against irreconcilable traitors or chaos-corrupted populations beyond redemption. These weapons were first-choice solutions, preferred tools, selected specifically because they were cleaner and easier than alternatives that might preserve life. Reform was expensive, requiring investment in infrastructure and social systems that diverted resources from military expansion. Evacuation was logistically complex, demanding transport capacity and resettlement planning that slowed conquest timelines. Negotiation was doctrinally unacceptable, establishing precedents that might encourage other populations to believe their voices mattered, so they died instead. I documented each weapon with mechanical precision, logging specifications and deployment histories, noting casualty figures that accumulated into numbers too large to conceptualize as individual deaths. 30 billion here, 50 billion there. Entire worlds erased from existence, their populations replaced with imported labor or servitor crews, their histories rewritten to explain away the void where generations had lived and died, believing their loyalty meant something. My training insisted this was merely data, information to be catalogued and preserved for future reference, but something deeper, something that predated my conditioning, understood that I was reading execution orders disguised as technical documentation. The hours blurred together. I worked through shift cycles without pause, consuming stale rations and recycled water, sleeping in brief intervals on the vault floor when exhaustion overwhelmed discipline. The servo skulls drifted through the aisles, monitoring my progress, recording my movements, ensuring I remained focused on the task rather than succumbing to reactions that might compromise the archive's security. Their presence was both comfort and threat, a reminder that I was observed, that my horror and disgust and growing rage were themselves being catalogued for future assessment. Container Sigma 142 contained something worse. Faith-reactive plague vectors. Biological weapons engineered to interact with the ecclesiarchy's standard pilgrimage rites, remaining dormant until triggered by mass prayer, synchronized devotional chanting, or the biochemical markers associated with religious fervor. The mechanism was elegant in its cruelty. Pilgrims would arrive at shrine worlds, gather in cathedrals holding hundreds of thousands, raise their voices in hymns that echoed through vaulted spaces designed to inspire awe and submission. And then, as their faith reached its apex, as their devotion manifested in measurable neurological and hormonal changes, the plague would activate. Death followed ecstasy so closely that witnesses often described it as rapture. The documentation included testimony from survivors, carefully edited and redacted, describing how their fellow pilgrims had begun to collapse mid-prayer, faces illuminated with transcendent joy, even as their organs liquefied and their skin split along stress lines invisible until the moment of failure. The dying continued singing until their vocal cords ruptured, continued praying until brain death terminated consciousness, convinced to their final moment that they were experiencing divine communion rather than weaponized biology. The plague spread through shared air and physical contact, its incubation timed to ensure maximum dispersal before symptoms manifested. By the time authorities recognized the outbreak, entire pilgrim fleets had departed for their home systems, carrying the contagion across subsector-wide networks. Why deploy such a weapon? The target was Shrine World Halathor, in subsector Thronewood, year 893 M41. The planet hosted no industry, produced no strategic resources, existed solely as a pilgrimage destination drawing the faithful from dozens of neighboring systems. Its population of 30 million consisted almost entirely of ecclesiarchy personnel, shrine keepers, and permanent pilgrims who had chosen to spend their final years in prayer rather than labor. By all doctrinal standards, Halathor represented the Imperium's spiritual ideal, a world wholly dedicated to the worship of the God Emperor, free from the compromises and corruptions that tainted industrial or military planets. But Halathor's cardinal prelate had begun advocating for doctrinal reforms, not heresy, not chaos worship, not any deviation from fundamental imperial theology. The cardinal simply argued that the ecclesiarchy should allocate more resources to charity and medical missions, that tithes collected from impoverished worlds might be partially returned to fund hospitals and orphanages, that the God Emperor's mercy should manifest in material aid rather than merely spiritual consolation. The proposals gained support among other cardinals, spread through theological networks, began appearing in sermons delivered across the subsector. The response was plague. The faith-reactive vectors were released during the Feast of the Ascension, when pilgrims numbered in the millions, when every cathedral on Halathor overflowed with the faithful singing hymns that reverberated through Planetary Vox networks. 200 million died across Halathor and the connected pilgrimage routes, their deaths attributed to a virulent mutation of some obscure bacterium, tragic but explicable, requiring nothing more than enhanced quarantine protocols and memorial services. The cardinal prelate perished alongside his flock, his reforms dying with him, his proposals quietly archived and forgotten. The Imperium learned that mercy was a structural inconvenience. I found myself standing in the aisle between containers, unsure how long I had been motionless, staring at nothing while my mind struggled to process what I was reading. This was not the Imperium I had served. Or rather, it was exactly the Imperium I had served, stripped of the narratives and myths that made service bearable, revealed in its essential nature as a machine that consumed its own components when they ceased to function according to parameters that had nothing to do with loyalty or faith or contribution. Every story I had been told, every justification I had repeated, every rationalization I had constructed to explain why suffering served a greater purpose, collapsed into ash. The truth was simpler and more terrible. The Imperium survived not by defending its people, but by perfecting how efficiently it could erase them. I continued documenting. Container after container revealed variations on the same theme. Reality collapsing devices that folded targeted population centers into spatial dimensions that could not sustain human life, leaving empty spaces where cities had stood, their inhabitants simply gone, displaced into mathematical abstractions that precluded survival or rescue. Mimetic weapons that overwrote cultural identity, causing populations to forget their histories and traditions, transforming them into blank vessels ready to accept whatever narrative authorities provided. Temporal distortion fields that accelerated local time flow, aging targeted populations through decades in subjective hours, eliminating resistance movements by letting their members die of old age while the rest of the Imperium experienced only a day's passage. Each weapon was documented with the same clinical detachment. Casualty estimates, deployment costs, operational efficiency ratings. recommendations for future improvements. The language was bureaucratic, sterile, drained of any acknowledgement that the numbers represented human lives, that each digit corresponded to someone who had possessed thoughts and dreams and relationships, who had trusted that their loyalty meant something beyond convenient compliance. Reading these files was like discovering that your family kept detailed records of which children they planned to quietly drown if resources became scarce, complete with cost-benefit analyses comparing drowning methods. I reached Subsector Thronewood, year 961. The file was smaller than most, a single data core containing limited documentation, much of it redacted with classification markers I could not bypass, even with my elevated clearances. What remained was fragmentary, a mining world, population 6 million, located at the subsector's trailing edge, resource output declining due to vein depletion, population requesting relocation assistance and retraining programs to transition from mining to agriculture or light manufacturing, request denied due to budget constraints and the availability of cheaper solutions. The cheaper solution was a reality-collapsing device designated Null Field Generator Mark 7. Deployment date 961 M41, 3rd month, 7th day. Device activated at local midnight, generating a spatial anomaly that folded the planet's primary settlement into a dimensional pocket from which extraction was technically possible but economically unjustifiable. 6 million people simply disappeared, their city replaced by a crater exhibiting unusual gravitational properties. Official explanation was a catastrophic mining accident, a chain reaction that destabilized the planetary crust, requiring the world be declared a navigation hazard and removed from commercial routes. I knew this planet, not from the documentation, not from the clinical descriptions and casualty figures. I knew it because I had been born there, because I had spent my first 14 years in hab blocks that smelled of ore dust and recycled air, because I remembered my mother waking me before dawn to prepare for school, while my father dressed for his shift in mines that descended so deep, the temperature exceeded human tolerance without environmental suits. I remembered the day the tremors began, felt them still in my bones, the low rumbling that built into a roar that swallowed screams and prayers alike. I remembered being at the settlement's edge, visiting a friend whose family lived near the agricultural domes, far enough from the primary habs that when the ground opened and the light went strange, bending in directions that hurt to perceive, I survived. 30,000 of us survived, scattered across the settlement's periphery, far enough from the anomaly's epicenter to escape its immediate effects. We were evacuated within hours, loaded onto bulk transports, and distributed across neighboring systems, our memories of the disaster carefully edited through trauma counseling and chemical intervention, our identities subsumed into new lives on new worlds. I was sent to a scholastic institution on Carsovan Prime, identified as possessing intellectual aptitude suited to inquisitorial service, trained and conditioned and molded into someone who could read about atrocities without flinching, who could process horrors as data points requiring catalog and analysis. They had murdered my world because relocating us was inconvenient, not because we rebelled, not because we fell to heresy, not because we posed any threat to the Imperium's survival or stability. They murdered us because we asked for help, because we believed that decades of loyal service, of sending our children into mines that claimed lives with casual regularity, of tithing resources that fueled conquests we would never witness, meant we had earned consideration when our usefulness ended. We were wrong. The Imperium does not owe its citizens anything beyond the privilege of dying in its service, and even that death must occur on terms that maximize efficiency and minimize expense. My world died quietly, its population erased in a single night, its loss explained away with lies so casual that no one questioned them. I had spent my entire adult life serving the institution that had murdered my family, cataloging its victories and documenting its righteousness, never knowing that my own survival was an accident, a geographic fluke that placed me outside the kill radius when someone decided 6 million lives were worth less than the cost of a few transport ships. I continued working, What else could I do? The vault door would not open without authorization from overseers who monitored my progress through servo skull relays. My clearances granted access to information but not freedom, knowledge but not agency. I was as trapped as the secrets surrounding me, buried beneath kilometers of stone and silence, existing only to serve a function that required my horror be subordinated to my duty. So I documented, I logged, I catalogued. I watched casualty figures accumulate into abstractions too vast for grief, each number containing uncounted multitudes who had believed their loyalty meant something, who had trusted that service would earn them a place in the Imperium's future rather than a silent death when they became inconvenient. Nerve agents that killed by shutting down pain receptors, ensuring victims felt nothing as their bodies failed. Atmospheric igniters that consumed oxygen across city-scale areas, causing populations to asphyxiate slowly, gently, sliding into unconsciousness that transitioned seamlessly into death without panic or struggle. Nanophage swarms that dissolved organic matter at the molecular level, leaving only inorganic infrastructure intact, entire populations reduced to component elements ready for industrial recycling. Gravity weapons that increased local gravitational force until human bodies crushed under their own weight, bones splintering, organs rupturing, death arriving too quickly for suffering, but slowly enough that control centers could adjust intensity based on real-time casualty tracking. Each weapon represented someone's innovation. Engineers had designed these systems with pride in their craftsmanship. Mechanicus adepts had optimized efficiency with the same devotion they applied to holy technologies. Military analysts had assessed deployment scenarios with professional thoroughness. The architects of genocide had been rewarded with promotions and commendations, their contributions recognized as valuable service to the Imperium's continued function. They slept soundly, if they thought of their work at all, knowing they had solved difficult problems with elegant solutions that minimized waste and maximized control. I found myself weeping at some point, though I could not identify the moment tears began or which specific revelation had breached my conditioning. The servo skulls recorded this, their optics focusing on my face with algorithmic interest, logging emotional responses for analysis by psychologists who would assess whether I remained suitable for continued service. I did not care. Let them see. Let them note that their savant, their loyal scholar, their obedient processor of forbidden knowledge, had discovered that loyalty was a trap, that service was collaboration in atrocity, that every day spent furthering the Imperium's goals contributed to a machine whose primary product was the efficient murder of those who built it. The archive contained documentation spanning over a century. Hundreds of deployments, thousands of targets, billions dead, their murders disguised as accidents, plagues, natural disasters, and divine judgment. The weapons evolved over time, becoming more sophisticated, more subtle, more capable of eliminating populations without leaving evidence or generating questions. Early devices were crude, obvious in their artificiality, requiring elaborate cover stories to explain away mass casualties. Later generations approached perfection, killing in ways that mimicked natural processes so closely that even skilled investigators could not distinguish murder from misfortune. The Imperium had been practicing. Each deployment refined doctrine, identified weaknesses, incorporated lessons learned. The documentation read like any other military after-action report, noting successes and failures, recommending modifications, suggesting improvements for future operations. Population size versus agent dispersal rates. Atmospheric composition effects on nerve agent stability. Cultural factors influencing susceptibility to mimetic weapons. The reports analyzed human populations as problems requiring solutions, reducing life to variables in equations that balanced cost against effect, measuring success not in lives saved but in resources conserved. I found a subsection dedicated to psychological operations. These were not weapons in the traditional sense, but protocols for managing populations adjacent to extermination events, ensuring neighboring systems did not recognize patterns or develop dangerous curiosities. The protocols were sophisticated, drawing on centuries of experience in social manipulation and information control. They specified memorial rites that channeled grief into approved expressions, preventing mourning from transforming into anger or investigation. They outlined narrative templates that explained tragedies as unavoidable consequences of hostile conditions, Xenos threats, or humanity's fallen nature, never as deliberate choices made by Imperial authorities. They included recommendations for identifying potential troublemakers, citizens who asked too many questions, administrators who noticed discrepancies in casualty reports, journalists who investigated official explanations too thoroughly. The protocols specified how such individuals should be handled, a graduated response beginning with social marginalization, escalating through professional destruction, and culminating in quiet disappearance for those who proved particularly persistent. Most such cases never progressed beyond early intervention stages, as few people possessed the will or resources to challenge narratives supported by every institution they had been taught to trust. The few who did vanish were never numerous enough to constitute patterns. I wondered how many curious scholars had sat in this vault before me, reading these same files, reaching these same conclusions. I wondered what had happened to them, whether they had been allowed to return to normal duties or whether the knowledge itself was considered contaminating, requiring containment measures that extended to those who possessed it. The servo skulls offered no answers, merely continued their silent observation, recording my every movement and expression for review by authorities who would decide my fate based on criteria I could not predict or influence. Hours became days. I lost track of time's passage, the vault's eternal twilight, erasing distinctions between morning and night, sleeping and waking. I subsisted on ration bars that tasted like compressed cardboard and water that tasted like metal. My body performed necessary functions while my mind wandered through memories of my childhood, of my mother's face and my father's laugh, and the friend I had been visiting when my world died. I wondered if they had felt anything, if the reality collapsing field had granted them any final moment of awareness, or if they had simply ceased to exist mid-thought, conversations ending incomplete, dreams interrupted by dissolution into mathematical abstractions. I hoped they had felt nothing. The archive included a section on alternative approaches, not alternatives to extermination, but alternatives to the specific methods employed, comparative analyses of different weapons and their relative merits for various scenarios. The documentation was breathtakingly thorough, examining factors ranging from deployment costs to religious implications to long-term psychological effects on surviving populations. It read like a consumer review guide, weighing pros and cons with the same dispassionate objectivity one might apply to selecting farming equipment. Nerve agents were cost-effective, but required sophisticated dispersal systems and left trace evidence detectable by advanced medical analysis. Faith-reactive plagues were elegant but unpredictable, occasionally spreading beyond intended targets or mutating in ways that complicated containment. Reality-collapsing devices were clean and permanent, but expensive, justified only when target populations occupied strategic locations or when examples needed to be particularly dramatic. Mimetic weapons were subtle and deniable but slow-acting, requiring months or years to fully erase cultural identities, unsuitable for scenarios requiring immediate results. Each method had its champions within the Inquisition and the Administratum. Factions argued passionately for their preferred approaches, supported by data and case studies, competing for budget allocations and deployment authority. These were not monsters debating atrocity, but professionals disagreeing about best practices, each convinced their methodology served the Imperium's interests more effectively than alternatives. They wrote papers, they delivered presentations, they built careers on innovations in populace elimination, advancing through imperial hierarchies by demonstrating exceptional skill in killing citizens too inconvenient to preserve. I found documentation of debates that read like academic conferences, proceedings from symposiums where inquisitors and administratum officials gathered to share findings and discuss emerging challenges, panel discussions on optimizing casualty rates while minimizing infrastructure damage, workshops on improving narrative control in high literacy populations, keynote addresses celebrating successful deployments that exceeded projected efficiency benchmarks. The language was collegial, respectful, marked by professional courtesy between individuals who recognized each other as experts in a shared field. They were talking about murdering billions, but they discussed it with the same tone theologians might use debating interpretations of scripture, or engineers comparing construction methodologies, or merchants negotiating trade agreements. The murders were simply their work, the thing they did professionally, deserving neither shame nor pride but merely competent execution according to established standards. They were civil servants performing duties assigned by legitimate authority, following protocols approved through proper channels, contributing to an institution they genuinely believed served humanity's survival. And perhaps it did. Perhaps the Imperium truly required this level of ruthless control to maintain cohesion across a million worlds, to prevent the fracturing and collapse that would doom humanity to extinction. Perhaps the alternative to efficient extermination was slow disintegration, civil wars that would kill far more than any compliance weapon, chaos incursions that would claim entire sectors rather than isolated worlds. Perhaps the architects of genocide were tragic heroes, making impossible choices in service to a greater good I lacked the vision to perceive. I did not believe this, but I understood why they might, why anyone might, why I myself might believe it if I occupied their positions and faced their responsibilities. The Imperium's ideology was self-reinforcing, structured to transform atrocity into duty, to frame murder as mercy, to ensure that those who implemented policy never had to witness its effects or acknowledge its victims as fully human. The system was designed to produce killers who never thought of themselves as killers, who could authorize extermination in the morning and attend prayer services in the evening without experiencing cognitive dissonance. I reached the archive's final section. Future projections, developmental roadmaps for next-generation compliance weapons, research initiatives exploring novel approaches to population elimination. The documentation was recent, dated within the last decade, suggesting this work was ongoing, active, continuously refined by institutions that viewed my world's death not as a tragic aberration but as a data point in an expanding database of proven methodologies. One proposal caught my attention: a weapon classified as Doctrine Null, designed to eliminate entire planetary populations by inducing synchronized neurological collapse across all human inhabitants simultaneously, regardless of location or protection. The mechanism was complex, involving coordinated bombardment from orbital platforms that generated harmonic resonance in the planet's magnetosphere, creating standing waves that penetrated shielding and void suits, reaching every human nervous system on the planet and inducing instant death. No survivors, no witnesses, no one left to tell stories or remember what had been lost. Doctrine Null was in final testing phases. The documentation indicated successful demonstrations on 3 isolated worlds, each with populations under 10 million, casualties confirmed at 100% with 0 structural damage to infrastructure. The weapon was being prepared for operational deployment, awaiting only bureaucratic approval to add it to the arsenal available for compliance operations. The costs were substantial, requiring dedicated orbital platforms and significant coordination between Navy and Administratum resources, but the results were considered worth the investment for scenarios requiring absolute certainty and maximum deniability. Within a decade, perhaps less, the Imperium would possess the capability to erase worlds with a button press. No dispersal systems to install, no agents to deploy, no risks of premature discovery or partial failure. Just targeted worlds and authorization codes, death delivered from orbit by crews who never saw their victims, who knew only that they were following orders transmitted from authorities they had no reason to question. The moral distance would be complete, the chain of causation so diffuse that no individual could be identified as responsible, no single decision could be isolated as the moment murder occurred. Everyone would be guilty. No one would be guilty. The Imperium would continue, its hands clean, its conscience unburdened by knowledge it had structured itself never to possess. I closed the final file and sat in silence that felt heavier than stone. The servo skulls hovered nearby, their optics dark, recording nothing because there was nothing left to record. I had completed my assignment. The archive was catalogued, cross-referenced, organized according to schema that would allow future savants to access information efficiently when next the Imperium required someone to document its own monstrosity. My work was thorough, professional, exemplary. I had followed protocols precisely, maintained objectivity throughout, produced documentation that met every standard expected of inquisitorial scholars. I had done my duty. The realization arrived quietly, without drama or revelation, settling into my thoughts like sediment drifting to the bottom of still water. I could not change what I had learned. I could not prevent future deployments or save populations already marked for extermination. I could not expose these secrets to populations who lacked clearance to know how thoroughly their loyalty was betrayed. Any attempt would be detected immediately, suppressed with the same efficiency applied to all structural inconveniences, my own death added to statistics that already numbered in the billions. I possessed no power except choice. I could complete my assignment and seal the archive, preserving these secrets for future servants of an institution that measured success by how efficiently it disposed of citizens it deemed inconvenient. Or I could refuse, could attempt some doomed gesture of resistance, could sabotage the documentation or destroy the archive, or simply sit in this vault until authorities came to remove me. The outcome would be identical. The archive would be restored from backup systems I lacked access to. Another savant would complete the work. The Imperium would continue, indifferent to my defiance, my name added to lists of individuals who proved unsuitable for continued service. Nothing I did would matter. This was the final truth, the one the archive could not speak directly, but which every page implied. Individual conscience was irrelevant to institutional function. Moral objection was a personal problem, to be overcome through conditioning or eliminated through removal. The Imperium was too vast, too ancient, too thoroughly structured around principles I opposed to be influenced by any action available to me. It would outlive my outrage. It would outlive my grief. It would outlive memory of my world and everyone I had loved. Their deaths recorded only in classified archives accessible to savants who would read about them with the same detachment I had brought to other worlds' extinctions before I discovered my own among the casualties. I could seal the archive or I could die in it. Those were the only choices the Imperium permitted. I thought about my mother, about the last morning I saw her alive, the way she had smiled while preparing breakfast, the way she had reminded me to study hard and honor the Emperor, the way she had believed that loyalty and service would secure our future. I thought about my father, about his hands scarred from decades in the mines, about his pride in his work and his certainty that his labor mattered, that he was building something larger than himself. I thought about my friend whose family I had been visiting, about games we had played and stories we had shared, about futures we had imagined that would never arrive. They had trusted the Imperium. I had trusted the Imperium. We were all wrong, but admitting it changed nothing. I activated the sealing protocols, watching as the archive systems acknowledged my completion of assigned tasks, registered my authorization codes, initiated lockdown procedures that would bury these secrets beneath layers of clearance and obfuscation until next they were needed. The servo skulls stirred, their optics glowing as they confirmed the archive's security, noted my compliance with protocols, marked me as a successful completion of institutional processes designed to ensure dangerous knowledge remained contained. I had become complicit, not through ignorance but through understanding, not through coercion but through choice, not through enthusiasm but through recognition that resistance accomplished nothing beyond my own destruction. I had looked into the Imperium's heart and found there not chaos or madness but perfect sanity, a logic so internally consistent that it required no justification beyond its own continued function. The Imperium survived, not by defending its people but by perfecting how efficiently it could erase them, and I had helped refine that perfection by ensuring its methods were thoroughly documented and readily accessible. The vault door unsealed. I walked through corridors that smelled of machine oil and old fear, rode lifts that carried me toward surfaces where sunlight still reached and people still believed their service meant something. My debriefing would be brief, perfunctory, conducted by administrators who cared only that the work was complete and I exhibited no signs of instability requiring intervention. I would return to my quarters, resume normal duties, catalogue other horrors in other archives, serve the Imperium until I died or became inconvenient enough to require elimination. I would remember my mother's smile and know it had meant nothing. I would remember my father's pride and know it had been misplaced. I would remember my own childhood faith in the Imperium's righteousness and know it had been a lie. Not because the Imperium lied, but because truth was simply irrelevant to institutions that measured success by survival rather than virtue. The lift reached the surface. I emerged into daylight that felt too bright after days in eternal twilight, walked across courtyards where inquisitorial personnel moved with purposeful efficiency, entered administrative sectors where my presence attracted no attention because I was simply another scholar completing assigned tasks. My hands did not shake, my voice did not waver when I provided required reports. My face displayed appropriate expressions of professional satisfaction at work completed satisfactorily. No one could see that I had died in that vault. No one could detect that the person who emerged was merely a shell, performing rituals of normalcy while internally I was screaming, had been screaming since the moment I recognized my world among the casualties, would continue screaming until death or madness offered relief. But the Imperium required only performance, not authenticity, only compliance, not conviction. I could hate it completely while serving it perfectly, could despise everything it represented while functioning flawlessly within its systems. This was the Imperium's genius. It did not require love or loyalty or belief. It required only participation, only that citizens perform assigned roles regardless of their private thoughts or feelings. Resistance meant nothing if it never manifested in action. Conscience meant nothing if it never influenced behavior. I could preserve my moral superiority intact while contributing daily to atrocities I condemned, could maintain my self-image as a decent person while enabling indecency at institutional scale. The archive would remain sealed until next it was needed. The weapons would remain ready for deployment against populations that became structurally inconvenient, that requested resources when obedience was sufficient, that believed loyalty earned them consideration rather than merely delayed their usefulness expiration date. My work had ensured future compliance operations could access historical precedents efficiently, could learn from past deployments, could refine methodologies that killed more cleanly and quietly with each iteration. I had helped, not through malice or enthusiasm, but through competent execution of assigned duties, through professional dedication to completing tasks thoroughly, regardless of personal feelings, through acceptance that my role was to document rather than judge, to preserve rather than condemn. I had been a good servant of the Imperium, and the Imperium rewarded good servants with continued employment until they became inconvenient. I understood my own future now. Someday, perhaps soon, perhaps decades hence, some administrator would review my files and note my emotional reaction to discovering my homeworld among the archive's casualties. They would consider whether this knowledge compromised my reliability, whether my personal connection to archived atrocities represented a security risk, whether I might become structurally inconvenient in ways that required elimination. The decision would be made dispassionately, professionally, according to protocols that considered only institutional interests rather than individual humanity. I would die quietly, efficiently, my death attributed to accident or illness or simple disappearance. No one would question it because no one questioned anything, because questioning was itself a form of structural inconvenience that marked individuals for eventual removal. The Imperium perpetuated itself through populations that performed loyalty without believing it. that served without expecting reciprocation, that accepted their own disposability as natural and necessary to humanity's survival. Perhaps it was. Perhaps the alternative truly was extinction, chaos, overwhelming, ordered civilization, xenos predators, consuming fragmented remnants of an empire that tried to value individual lives over collective continuation. Perhaps my moral revulsion was a luxury humanity could not afford, a weakness that would doom us if allowed to influence policy. Perhaps the inquisitors and administratum officials who designed compliance weapons were heroes bearing unbearable burdens so that others could live in comfortable ignorance of what survival required. I did not believe this, but I could not disprove it, could not demonstrate with certainty that humanity might survive without industrialized extermination of its own populations, could not prove that reform and investment and actual loyalty to citizens might serve the Imperium better than efficient murder. The burden of proof rested with those who claimed alternatives existed, and I possessed no evidence beyond moral intuition that screamed atrocity, while policy insisted necessity. So the archive remained sealed. So the weapons remained ready. So I remained employed, useful, complicit. I attended prayer services where priests celebrated the Emperor's mercy and his endless protection of humanity against darkness that surrounded us. I listened to sermons about sacrifice and duty and the nobility of service to something larger than ourselves. I watched congregations bow their heads in reverence to an institution that would murder them without hesitation if they became inconvenient, that measured their worth in productivity metrics and compliance statistics, that preserved their loyalty only as long as it cost less than alternatives. They believed because believing was easier than knowing. I envied them. The weight of knowledge was crushing, transforming every interaction into performance, every moment into hypocrisy. I smiled when expected, laughed when appropriate, engaged in conversations about trivial concerns as if any of it mattered, as if we were not all simply temporary components in a machine that would discard us when we ceased functioning optimally. I maintained friendships with colleagues who would approve my elimination if assigned to review my file, who would read casualty reports about my death with the same detachment I had brought to reading about my own world's extermination. This was what service meant. Not heroism or sacrifice, but participation in systems that ground individuals into statistics, that transformed persons into resources, that measured success by how efficiently life could be converted into death when circumstances required it. The Imperium was not evil in any simple sense. It was merely indifferent, operating according to logic that recognized only survival and expansion as meaningful values, dismissing everything else as sentiment that complicated necessary decisions. Weeks passed into months. I completed other assignments, catalogued other archives, documented other aspects of Imperial function with the same professional competence that had earned me assignment to the Vault. My work remained exemplary. My behavior remained appropriate. My psychological evaluations showed acceptable stability, minor trauma responses within normal parameters for individuals exposed to classified material, no indicators suggesting reliability concerns that would justify intervention. I was a successful outcome. The system had processed me correctly, exposed me to corrosive knowledge while ensuring my conditioning remained intact, tested my loyalty by showing me the Imperium's true nature and confirming I would serve regardless. I had passed tests I did not realize I was taking, demonstrated my suitability for continued employment through actions I could not undo or reconsider. The archive waited beneath the fortress, sealed and ready for next the Imperium required documentation of its own monstrosity. Future savants would read what I had catalogued, would learn what I had learned, would reach the same conclusions and make the same choices because the system permitted no alternatives except destruction. The cycle would continue, generation after generation, each discovering that loyalty was betrayal, that service was complicity, that the Imperium survived by consuming its own servants with the same efficiency it applied to external enemies. I thought often about Doctrine Null, about the weapon that would erase worlds with orbital bombardment, about populations that would die without warning or knowledge that murder had occurred. It seemed almost merciful compared to alternatives, death so swift and complete that victims never knew they were being killed, never experienced the moment of betrayal when they realized their loyalty meant nothing. Perhaps that was what the Imperium would eventually become, an institution that killed so efficiently that death preceded awareness, that erased populations before they could feel pain or fear or disappointment. Perhaps that was the ultimate expression of Imperial mercy. I could no longer distinguish between cynicism and truth, between despair and insight, between the person I had been before the Vault and the person I was becoming after. The transformation was ongoing, gradual, measured in small concessions and quiet acceptances, in moments when I chose performance over authenticity, because authenticity served no purpose beyond making me feel better about collaboration I could not prevent. The Imperium did not care what I felt. It cared only what I did, and what I did was serve it faithfully, competently, with dedication that would be rewarded with continued employment until I became inconvenient. My mother would have been proud of my position, my accomplishments, my success in rising to serve the Inquisition directly. My father would have seen in my career the validation of his own sacrifices, proof that his labor had secured opportunities for his child. They would have been wrong, but they died believing. And perhaps that was the only mercy the Imperium truly offered, the gift of ignorance that allowed citizens to die trusting that their service had meant something, that their loyalty had been reciprocated, that the institution they served recognized their humanity and valued their contributions. The lies were kinder than truth, so I maintained them, for myself if no one else, pretending that my work served purposes beyond institutional self-perpetuation, that my documentation preserved history rather than normalizing atrocity, that my continued service represented choice rather than resignation to inevitability. I sealed the archive because opening it would change nothing. I authorized its continued secrecy because revelation would accomplish nothing except my own destruction and my replacement by someone who lacked personal connection to the casualties, who could catalog exterminations with pure professionalism unmarred by grief or rage or recognition. I became what the Imperium required. A servant who understood exactly what he served, who chose complicity with full knowledge, who performed loyalty while knowing loyalty was performance, who accepted that survival required participation in systems he despised because refusal meant only that someone else would participate instead. This was the final lesson the archive taught. Not that the Imperium was monstrous, but that monstrosity was systemic, distributed across so many individuals and institutions that no one could be held responsible. No single person could be identified as the source of atrocity. No act of resistance could disrupt machinery that operated independently of any individual's participation or refusal. The weapons would remain ready. The deployments would continue. Populations would die quietly, efficiently. Their murders disguised as accidents or natural disasters. Their names recorded only in archives accessible to savants who would read about them with professional detachment, who would catalogue their deaths alongside billions of others, who would serve the Imperium faithfully because faithfulness was all the Imperium required. I had learned what the Imperium was. I had learned what I was. I had learned that knowledge changed nothing, that understanding served only to make complicity conscious rather than unconscious, that the vault beneath the fortress contained not merely records of atrocity, but a mirror showing what service truly meant. I continued serving. What else could I do?